Hello. I'd like to welcome everyone to the third meeting of CSRIC 7, which I now open. Today you'll be voting on a group of updates that you received from ADIS that will go into the best practices database that has CSRIC best practices. And then you will be hearing from each of the working group chairs about their progress thus far.
Thank you, Suzanne. I'll apologize for my voice today. I'm recovering from a cold, so sorry about being a bit hoarse. Welcome, everyone. We have some people on the phone as well. We'll do a roll call first, and then we'll take the vote. So let's start out. Brandon Abley. Thank you. Mark Annis.
Present.
Mary Boyd. Sorry, Mary.
Yes, ma'am.
Wade Buckner.
Present.
Brian Daly. Is that Brian?
Present.
Jay English.
Present.
Lori Flaherty.
Present.
Craig Fugate. Sorry. Fugate. Okay. Robert Gessner.
Present.
Thank you. James Gerke.
Present.
Thank you. Mark Hess.
Present. On the phone.
Thank you. Antoine Johnson. Farouk Khattab.
Present.
Hi, Farouk. Chandra Katara.
Present. On the phone.
Thank you. Jeff Littlejohn. Tim Lorello.
Present on the phone.
Thank you. Michelle Vanelli McInerney. Danny McPherson.
Present via alternate.
Yeah. Joe Meyer.
Present.
Susan Miller.
Steve Barclay for Susan Miller.
Okay. Richard Perlato.
Present on the phone.
Thank you. Michael Ropp.
Present on the phone.
Pat Roberts. Pat.
Here, present.
Jeff Robertson. And then we have an alternate for Travis Russell.
Yes,
Cheryl?
Cheryl Davis.
Francisco Sanchez.
Present.
Dorothy Spears Dean. Lee Thibodeau.
Present.
Brian Trosper.
Present on the phone.
Steve Watkins.
Present via phone.
Thank you. And John Williamson. Okay, I'm going to ask that the folks that are on the phone mute unless they want to speak up, since it's an interactive bridge and we may have some feedback if we don't do that, and we have quite a few folks today on the phone. Any questions to start out the meeting? Okay, we're going to move towards the council vote. Suzanne sent something out on 11/26, which was associated with some updates to the CSRIC best practice database. And so the CSRIC best practices are available to the public through an online database that is accessible through both the FCC and ADIS websites, which are identical. ADIS has long served as a repository and administrator of the best practices database with editorial privileges to ensure that each set of CSRIC best practices is added to the database. ADIS has recently launched a project to upgrade the entire database to make it more user-friendly. Last month, Suzanne sent a list of updates, changes, which included new best practices from CSRIC 6, as well as updates to make the database current through language standardization, some non-substantive edits, and the retiring of best practices that have been superseded. Today, we're going to take a vote to approve this set of BPs so that they may be added to the database. If you have any questions prior to the vote, we have Jackie Waldermoth from ADIS to answer any of those questions. So I'm going to open it to any questions that are either on the phone or in the room associated with what has been proposed in the vote.
Madam Chair.
Yes, Mary.
Mary Boyd, just a comment. I want to express sincere appreciation for the efforts of the team within ADIS The new system is awesome. Worked through both systems, and I think everybody will be very pleased in how easy it is to use. And we'll be able to also use that tool as we create best practices within the CSRIC environment. So thank you guys for that work. I'd also offer, if you have no additional questions or clarification, a motion to accept the recommendations on the, from Addis on the CSRIC best practices.
Second.
Thank you. Do all agree? Ayes?
Aye.
Aye.
Any nays?
Aye.
Okay. Thank you very much for that, Mary and Joe, and the council vote shows approval of those changes. The other thing I would say is that Jackie indicated that if anybody would like to understand more about the new tool and how to get best practices in, she'd be more than happy to help folks, and she'll be sending out a message to all the working groups of CSRIC 7. Okay, working forward, we're going to hear from all of the working groups today. It's really going to be a day of updates. And with that, we're going to hear first from Working Group 1, Alert Originator Standard Operating Procedures. And Wade Buckner will be providing that update on behalf of Craig. And he's moving up to the podium as we speak.
Okay, good afternoon. My name is Wade Buckner again with IAFC, International Association of Fire Chiefs. Again, presenting on behalf of Working Group 1 for Chair Greg Fugate, who wasn't able to make it today because of some flight arrangements and everything. This time, Work Group 1 has been tasked with the emergency alert notification or systems. The 4 mandates that we had from the FCC was to establish and maintain communication between industry stakeholders, broadcasters, cable providers, wireless providers, and alert originators. Develop and maintain relationships between the communications providers and alert originators that can readily be leveraged during emergencies. Measures to establish redundant and effective lines of communications with key stakeholders during emergency, to include GETS, or the Government Emergency Telecommunications Service, and the Wireless Priority Service, or WPS. Also, the important elements that should be included in alert messages that retract or correct false alerts. So far, we've had two meetings. We've had 2 organizational meetings at this time, with another meeting planned on the 13th, on Friday. Our focus is just basically make sure that we need to make any corrections or amendments to the original tasks that we were done. Looking at the first 3 being more best practices, with the 4th, of course, being a standard operating procedure, especially when you look at today's environment with the accuracy and also the ability to be able to retract those false, notifications. At this point, too, we'll be looking to have our report ready on the SOPs on September 2020.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Wade, for that readout of Working Group 1. Next, we're going to have Working Group 2, Lee Thibodeau, Managing Security Risks in the Transition to 5G.
Good afternoon. My name is Lee Thibodeau. I'm Chief Technical Officer and Vice President of Engineering at Insight, and I'm here to present the update for Working Group 2. Subject area for Working Group 2 is managing security risk in the transition to 5G networks. By way of background, I think I went the wrong direction here. Here we go. Many wireless carriers are beginning to roll out 5G networks, and in fact, this morning I read that there are more than 30 5G networks being implemented around the world, either implementation or operational already. And many of those initial architectures incorporate standards from previous wireless technologies. So the FCC and CSRIC have asked Working Group 2 to review the vulnerabilities in those previous technologies and make recommendations to mitigate those as we move forward. There have been a number of vulnerabilities that have been identified in previous CSRICs in 4G vulnerabilities, and we've been asked to take a look at those for the future implementations of 5G. In addition, the Commission has asked us to take a look at the standards and recommend best practices and updates for standards going forward. Working Group 2 has 2 deliverables to the Commission, to the Council. Our first report is due in June of 2020, and that's the report on the risks of 5G from legacy vulnerabilities and look at best practices to mitigate those. Our second report is due in December of 2020, and that's a review of standards and make recommendations to updates or additions to standards. More specific deliverables that Working Group 2 has is to focus on the transition to 5G. And this is kind of where we have to distinguish our work from that of Working Group 3. And you'll hear from Working Group 3 a little bit more about that as well. But Working Group 2 will focus on option 3X. Option 3, which is really the transition phase where many carriers will begin implementing 5G technologies. There's a number of reasons for that, is that many carriers want to be able to either have a tight interoperability between 4G and 5G. They may want to preserve investment in their 4G networks. And in particular, the company I work for example, is a small carrier, and it's very important that we have a seamless transition, and that investment in 4G has to last us a long time. When we talk about those issues, we talk about the distinction between our work and that of Working Group number 3. This is just a list of the Working Group members. I want to publicly thank the Working Group members for their commitment. We've had great engagement from all the team members. As well, a number of the team members, based on their work commitments, have designated alternates for the Working Group, and they've been very vigorously engaged in the work so far as well, so I wanted to recognize those alternates and thank them. Where Working Group 2 stands right now is we have implemented and have ongoing weekly discussions with the Working Group. We've defined a timeline and work schedule for report number 1, and we've been working gathering information from academia, from industry, and from government sources. We've had a number of presentations from researchers, and we've begun with that drafting our report number 1. As well, we've had a number of joint calls and joint meetings with Working Group 3 to make sure our work is coordinated and we don't leave gaps or have a great deal of overlap and confusion between the work of those two. So our next steps as we move forward are obviously continuing our weekly work drafting report number 1. We're continuing to recruit and find additional sources to add to the knowledge base in the subject area. And we continue to work with Working Group 3 to make sure, as I mentioned, that we don't leave any gaps or duplicate any work. And then once we get traction here and we're really making good progress for the stage we're at, we'll begin defining the timeline and work plan for our report number 2 that is due in December. As well, finally providing periodic updates to the Council. So with that, if anyone has any questions, comments for Working Group 2, I will try to entertain you. Thank you.
Thank you, Lee. Moving on to Working Group 3, and it's managing security risk in emerging 5G. And I believe Brian is going to represent, or is Farouk going to try to do it from afar?
Was going to try to do it. Let's see if he...
Yes, Madam Chair, if it's okay, I would like Brian Daly has kindly agreed to.
Okay, Brian's going to take the stage.
So thank you, Farouk. So I'm representing Working Group 3, and if we can bring the slides up. Working Group 3 is managing the security risk in emerging 5G implementations. And what we would like to present today is the initial work plan for Working Group 3. As far as our working group description, for those familiar with 3GPP, know that Release 16 is in progress and scheduled to complete in the March 2020 timeframe. What the working group will do is look at potential risks introduced by the 5G core network elements and weaknesses in the relevant 3GPP standards to understand those and determine what appropriate mitigations can be undertaken. The FCC has directed us to evaluate Release 15 and 16 standards. Release 15 has been complete, and as mentioned, Release 16 is in progress and will be complete in early 2020. We want to identify the areas of risk and develop mitigation strategies to minimize the risk in core 5G network elements and architectures. In addition, we also are directed to identify any optional features in proposed or work-in-progress 5G standards that can diminish the effectiveness. And the working group is going to review the reports out of CSRIC 6, Working Group 3, which looked at network reliability and security risk reduction, as well as the relevant 3GPP specifications to develop a new report on risks introduced by Release 15 and 16 5G standards. Furthermore, the working group will make recommendations to mitigate risks introduced by the standards, and this report will include identifying optional features in those proposed standards, as well as ways to diminish identify ways that can diminish the effectiveness of 5G security and make recommendations to address those gaps. Again, I'd like to thank all the working group members for stepping up and contributing to the working group. Listed here are the members. There are also subject matter experts that participate on the calls as alternates to the members that bring in the expertise in the security area. What we have done so far is finalize the membership for the working group. We've held bi-weekly conference calls with additional calls as needed, and we have a document library established which under ADIS control allows us to maintain contributions, reference documents, calendars, and so forth. We have two deliverables that we've defined. The first report will be a report on the risks introduced by Release 15 and 16 5G standards. Target completion of that report is September 2020. And the second report is the recommendations on mitigating those risks that are introduced by the standards. And this report will include identifying those optional features that we have identified in proposed standards that can also diminish the effectiveness of 5G security. And this second report is targeted to complete in March of 2021. For those familiar with the 3GPP architecture, there's different options for deploying 5G, and those different options are shown here. The first is what's called non-standalone option. That's the far left on the screen. That is where you use LTE and the existing LTE Evolved Packet Core network to support the 5G new radio. And this is called non-standalone because it doesn't include the 5G core and relies on LTE for providing some of the capabilities and functionality. Option 2, which is the next one, is the standalone. This is where the 5G next generation core is introduced, as well as the new radio, and does not rely on the LTE or the existing LTE Evolved Packet Core network. And then option 7 and option 4 are other non-standalone options that could be used in the migration path that operators could use between option 3 to get to option 2. The primary focus of Working Group 3 will be on option 2, the standalone, and related options with the 5G core network. The status, we've reviewed a number of security-related documents and presentations, both from research entities as well as the standards organizations. We drafted a baseline document for the first report, and we started discussion on new security features of Release 16. The next steps, we're going to continue on our work plan, continue the analysis of Release 16 security features, and identify any potential gaps, continue the baseline report development, and conduct routine biweekly conference calls to review the existing work in the area, develop new recommendations, and finally provide periodic status updates to the steering committee and council. So that concludes Working Group 3 update. Any questions?
Any questions from the phone?
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Farouk. All right, moving on to Working Group 4, 911 security vulnerabilities during the IP transition. And Mary Boyd will be presenting that.
Good afternoon, council. Hang on one second. Let's see, I'm going to next, correct? Okay, so just as a refresher for council and our guest on the web, this is an initiative that's once again focused on transition. There's a real theme going on in the room, but it's specific to 911. These action items for Working Group 4 really come from recommendations of CSRIC 6, Work Group 1. We didn't have the expertise to deal with some of the security elements for the transition from a legacy network to an IP 911 network. So you can see from the slide, really in that hybrid state, that's what we're focused on. There becomes risk in that transition, and our focus is on that security risk at this point. We have several objectives as part of our deliverables. One, as I indicated, identify the security risk and the legacy networks, but we're also to look at the transitional phases as well as a full next-gen 911 and recommend best practices that will address mitigating the risk of attacks on those networks in all three areas, not necessarily just that transitional legacy IP environment. And then the commission has asked us to look at the vulnerabilities, put them on a scale in terms of importance and risk, and then look at the remediation expense behind mitigating those risks. The other objective is, and my apologies, I think in our last council meeting, I failed to also draw out the other additional assignment we got, and that is to survey the current state of interoperability of our 911 systems throughout the country. And the commission actually, as we look at legacy transition into next gen, the commission did help us a lot by going ahead and defining the term interoperability, so we didn't debate that for the next 18 months. So I send my appreciation to the commission for that, because we would. So if we look at our first report, actually our new deliverable, I want to thank Suzanne and the commission. We actually asked for some flexibility in report dates and change up some of what had been proposed to Working Group 4. So our first report really is looking at the current state of interoperability in the country. We're definitely mindful of the rules that govern the data and the surveys, and not to violate those. Suzanne will not violate those. Russell does a good job of reminding us of that as well. And we're going to look at existing reports. Lori Flaherty with the 911 Program Office has been very good to upload on the Addis workspace documents that defined and worked with, actually back to the TFOPA report with the commission, the maturity models as we transition across the country. Lori's also been in a very big initiative of a study that really is the 2018 status of deployments in our country, and she thinks that's going to be ready for us by the end of the year. Fingers crossed. So that'll be a major data source for us in being able to meet this deliverable. We're also working with the public safety associations, NENA, ABCO, NASNA, to look at what other resources there are should Lori's report still need some additional data added to it. The next deliverable that we have is our report number 2. This is really going on to look at the vulnerabilities in that transition in the hybrid system state and those architectures. So we're going to look at historical data. We're going to, we'll go through and use probably some of the prior work that's been done, but really the focus on cybersecurity on that. Then the third report, which the working group just really thought that we needed to take these sort of in first, second, third stages instead of working them parallel, because they did have such impacts to the final report, which is really when we look at those commingled networks and we begin to look at what did cost to mitigate it and the priorities on that. So that will be our last report that we'll bring to the council, and I have in here dates so you can see what that looks like. But I also just want to take a minute and give a big thank you to the working group members. Some of these folks on this list have been all the way back to the TFOPA days. So that helps us a lot in a heavy lift in a short time frame. And some of us still have our tattoos from the TFOPA days. But actually, this is a great group of expertise that we need in order to meet these deliverables. Here's where we are on our status. We do have all the work group membership and the alternates finalized. Certainly those, we could come in and perhaps have some more alternates, but at this point, nobody's raised a request for that. We've got the structure completed, and then for the report number 1, we actually have a sub-team that's been added for that particular report structure. We do have weekly meetings. The sub-team for report 1 also meets weekly. We utilize as our major tool for document retention, emails, calendar, everything is the Addis workspace. If your teams are not using that, I really encourage them to get familiar with it because it just makes managing these tasks a lot easier. Our schedule is that report 1 will come to the council in March. And then report 1, report 2 will be September, and then report 3 will be our last one that will be in March of 2021. For report 1, as I indicated, we're working weekly on this initiative. We are still trying to finalize, waiting on some of Lori's data, the final schedules of when we will get, all of our drafts finished, but we'll know more in the, coming weeks. But we also have a template that's been developed off of the maturity model that'll be used with the associations if Lori doesn't have all the data that we need to be able to report what the country looks like. So we're prepared for that, and then we'll move forward quickly. Our plan is to have the draft to commission staff in February. So our next steps really is just to continue working report 1 on a weekly basis. Certainly during the holidays, we'll cancel those meetings since I think they're right smack dab in the middle of the holidays. So no expectations for people to work with us then, but we will give you updates as we make progress, and I'm confident we will make that March deadline. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. Any questions for Mary?
Oh, sorry, I failed. Sorry. It's gone. Any questions? Good. All right. Thank you.
Thank you. Turning to Working Group 5, Improving Broadband Resiliency. Pat Roberts is going to give the update on that.
It's just failed from
Thank you very much. It's great to be here. The weather seems a little interesting. We tried to get here from Florida, and flights were all delayed. But Working Group 5 has been doing a great job. I want to thank all the members, the input and all that. I've got a lot of stuff here, but I will just try to walk through if it comes up. What do I need to hit next?
There you go.
Oh, okay. Let me see. So anyway, we're looking at the broadcast community and how we serve during storms, disasters, and we're making it a little broader than just disasters and storms because you've got things like floods, you've got the wildfires. So, but our mission was to look at how we're ready to be prepared and bring on resiliency from the broadcasters, working with the local communities. The group has been very active. As you can see, we were directed by the FCC to specifically look at natural disasters and walk through everything. And so we've asked both city, county, and other broadcast partners to work with us on this so we can get back on the air quickly. The deliverables, as you've probably seen before, is we're going to study the existing best practices and develop a new set of guidance for the future for both TV and radio and all of our allied partners now that that's expanding. When storms hit, whether it's the generator or at the studio or at the tower, we've got to make sure we stay on the air. So we're looking at not only the transmission site, but also the studio site. And we talked to the FCC staff. They let us expand it a little broader than we started out. Next, we've got the outline about the radio stations and their operation and backup power in the site and at the studio, but also the partnership. Many of you may or may not know, but nowadays, TV and radio stations do partnerships because a lot of radio don't have newsrooms, so they put a partnership together. Plus, if you lose power, you're not going to have television. So radio becomes the true lifeline at the end of the thing when there's no power in the community. So, and then we're going to review the new role of social media because the last few storms, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter have played a major role from broadcasters reaching their residents both in the market that they live in as well as people that have left the market. Next, I want to thank all the group. I just said we've got an incredible group made up of broadcasters, but also cable, the wireless community, and then local and state emergency management people. And they've all given us input. We're gathering data, and we're having bi-weekly calls and getting everything organized. We're going to have another discussion in this month. We'll keep moving forward on a draft. And then our goal is to have the draft ready in January so all the members can have input. And we'll keep having phone calls. And then our final report is due to this group in March of 2020, this coming up March. The next thing I thought I would show you is we're doing it, kind of breaking it down in some other groups. That's just kind of the outline of the schedule. But we broke our group into 3 subgroups, the broadcast people and friends of broadcast, to look at what they already have written. There's a lot of reports, some are proprietary, some aren't, and look at that. But then we decided the key is getting along well with whether it's FEMA or the FCC, but also local emergency management. So, and I can't thank Francisco and other people enough for coming up and saying, how do we get broadcasters who are first informers to work with local emergency management and fire and police? So if they need fuel, they don't run into a problem. They're not looked at as an adversary. They're looked at as the lifeline to the community. So the emergency management group's been great. Then the last we put together was like cable, wireless, the internet's plans for the stations, and social media, because it's changed. And we've got a number of people in that subgroup that's been very, very helpful feeding everything in. So we're on schedule, and I think we'll make our deadline. Any questions? Thank you.
Thank you, Pat. And lastly, we have Working Group 6, which is SIP, Security Vulnerabilities. And Young Kim is going to read out for Danny McPherson.
Thank you.
Yep.
All right. First, I want to thank the working group members and their organization for participating in this mission. This can't be done without their support, so really appreciate their efforts on this. The work group had their official kickoff meeting on November 13th, and within the work group, we discussed the ground rules as well as sort of the sort of next steps, the next action items, as well as work through some of the technical difficulties that we had, but we worked that out. The key thing that we discussed in the kickoff was really taking the work and breaking it down to phases, really more of a chunkable approach. So the first step that we're going to do as part of phase 1, I call it phase 1A, is really catalog and review the security vulnerabilities within SIP. And really appreciate Vladimir Wolfencroft from Twidlow and John Peterson from Newstar for really taking the lead on this effort with Danny McPherson. And then phase 1B, which is then taking their work and outlining how the industry is addressing these security vulnerabilities as well too. And both those tasks are on track for a Q1 2020 deliverables. It's a draft for the working group. Phase 2 is then to really identify the gaps in the industry, and we're hoping to have that completed within Q2 of 2020. And then phase 3 is really to take the culmination of the work and then develop new recommendations or update existing best practices on how we address these vulnerabilities in the industry. And that's really on track for Q3 of 2020 as well too. And we're going to take all the work that's here, and then really, the plan is to then have a final deliverable for the committee titled SIP Security Challenges and Their Mitigations by March 2021. But in between now and then, we're going to take the phases and the action items and really break them down to a working plan and put some leads with those action items, and then really execute against those plans. So, that's it. Any questions? All right, thank you very, oh, yes, sir.
So the Workgroup 6 charge does reference the importance of SIP to the next generation of 911, for example. Have you thought at all about how you might bring that part of it into?
That's a great question, and I think that's something that I'll take back to the group, and we'll discuss it as part of how do we incorporate the 911 session protocols into this work group as well too. So happy to do so.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Young. So it looks like we've covered all 6 working groups. Let me just see if there are any questions that have come up since people have been sitting back and listening. Any questions on the phone or in the room? Okay, so I think March is going to be an exciting time frame. We're going to have some readouts of some recommendations. The next CSRIC meeting is scheduled for Tuesday, March 17th, so we can wear our green if you want on that day. And I look forward to continuing to work with each of the groups, and I think we've made really, really good progress. And I think Mary said it best. There's a lot of things on our agenda that are associated with trying to manage risk across the entire telecommunications footprint, and it clearly is extremely important. With that, Suzanne?
I just want to say thank you to everyone for the presentations, and especially I'd like to add my thank you to Addis for all you've been doing for CSRIC, from helping the working groups manage their documents to the best practices database. We really appreciate it. With that, I close the meeting. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.